Hey everyone, hopefully you're having a good week. Hopefully you got through week one with no problems, no scars, and hopefully you're enjoying what we're learning here in this class. It's probably a little different than the other things that we've done in the program, but really important overall in the scheme of healthcare administration. So this week, we're going to talk a little bit about the process of policymaking, and we'll focus on that really throughout the rest of the class in various aspects. But we're going to kind of do the overview side of it. And remember that in these videos each week, different than I talked about this in last week's, different than what I've done typically in my classes with a review of the week before, we're going to be focusing on this week's work in this video. So I will put up a summary or either an announcement or maybe a short video, depends on how everyone does, for the info in the quiz, and if there's anything I feel I need to tie up from last week. But otherwise, these videos are kind of new each week for the new material. So like I said, we're going to be talking about the process of health policy making, which is chapter 3 in our text. I'm also going to talk a little bit about your opioid written assignment, which is that's at the end, but we'll be talking about that a little bit. And I promise I'm going to try to keep this much shorter than last week's. So the one thing that we want to think of course, we are right now not in industry, but we are academics. So even though you may work in a job where you can impact policymaking or where you're implementing policy, remember that here in this space, we're academics. So we are looking at frameworks, theories, how theories are, fit within the way things are happening. We may have, and as it is discussed in the book, as we'll talk about here, there are a multitude of theories for policymaking, but policymaking is a very human process. So even though there may be a multitude of theories, the different theories will apply in different ways as the process moves along. So all you need to do to see that is, compare the fervor and the excitement about the Affordable Care Act when President Obama was in office to the vile and hatred toward it as President Trump came into office. Part of that was political, but part of it was, okay, here's this policy, and it didn't really implement in exactly the same way we thought it would. So it's a very human process. It's a very political process, and so it's important to look at it from the academic side, but then also step back and look at real life examples to see how things are proceeding. Another good example is Medicare. When the law was passed to put Medicare in place back in the 60s, that had been for a long, long time, a horrible thing. Nobody wanted it. No, nobody thought it would work. Nobody thought it was needed. Because unfortunately at that time there were many people over the age of 65 or that were disabled that did not have coverage and couldn't access services. So very sad situation, very much like what we're facing right now with the entire population. How do we make sure our whole population is covered? At that point in the 60s, we were talking about our elderly and disabled folks, and how do we get them covered? So theirs was kind of an opposite of what we saw in the ACA. ACA was positive then negative. With the Medicare Act leading up to where they finally were able to get it passed, it had been, just barred and banned, and nobody wanted it until it finally was passed. And it's really been a positive, I think, for just from a studying standpoint, examining the Medicare program and how it works, but then also obviously for access to care for those that are eligible for that program. So we'll talk briefly. There's much more detail in the text, but so we have what they call frameworks, and a couple of them. Stages heuristic is one, policy triangle, and these are a way for us to think about the policymaking process. So the stages heuristic, and I'm going to refer to the book here quick, they talk about 4 stages: agenda setting, formulation, implementation, and evaluation. And we'll talk more about the way things actually happen. But that's a good example of, okay, here's this framework. It has these 4 steps. It's pretty simplistic, but it is really the way things work. All of those 4 steps are blown up into many other steps. But as we look at that, the way those 4 things proceed, it can give us an idea of how things work when it comes to policymaking. Theories, they are a bit more specific than frameworks. Frameworks, again, very general framework. Theory is much more specific. And for example, the multiple streams talks about kind of information and data coming in different streams. So there's a stream related to politics. There's a stream related to possible solutions to another stream, which is our policy-related issues, an issue or a problem. So those streams can flow in, and there's kind of like a sweet spot where those streams come together and converge, and that gives us that window of opportunity to be able to move forward and hopefully make positive action on the problem on behalf of those that are in need of that solution. But there are multitudes of these, and like I said, in the academic world, unfortunately, the work of many academics is to create theory. So there are multitudes of them. What's really more important is understanding the whole the policymaking process. So we'll talk about that. So there are kind of 3 different pieces: formulation, implementation, and modification. This is in your book. This particular exhibit. So it talks about, here's our formulation phase here, setting an agenda, going through that whole process. I talked a little bit about that window of opportunity. These are our problem solutions and politics coming together. That's that multiple streams theory. And hopefully it would create legislation, and it's really just a circular process as we continue to look at various issues in our industry and in our country overall. So once something is formulated, it would then move to the implementation phase if it's passed, and implementation phase is very much like as we see any type of a PDCA cycle or process improvement cycle, where we design something, we actually make a rule about it, and we get it into operation, and then we evaluate it. And that evaluation is going to lead down here to modification. So we may modify our policy to make this truly a true process improvement cycle. And you think about the ACA. So, the ACA went through all of this, then it came over here, it was designed, implemented. And as we do this evaluation, I'm sure the Obama administration, and it's been kind of overshadowed over the last couple of years, but I'm sure they themselves were like, there's some things here we need to fix. Then with the change in administration, they were looking to just, not necessarily modify, but just chuck out the window. Obviously, that wasn't an option, wouldn't have worked. But they are kind of in this modification phase, and we have made modifications to the ACA, dropping the mandate. Lots of different things have changed. So it's just that constant cycle. But the one key of all of this, and we see this, overall, and it's kind of the overarching piece that we look at, is the external environment. And we'll look more about, I think we have probably a week and a half just about that environment and the impact of the external environment on the policymaking process. So we'll talk much more about that. So in the formulation phase, so I'll come back here. So we're talking about this window here. The first step is that agenda setting, the development of legislation by the policymakers. So, keep in mind it's a legislative process. And then this is, and when we talk about it being a very human process, it's human and it's also bureaucratic. So on the federal level, there are 13 steps to move forward to develop develop legislation at that federal level. So a lengthy process. But hopefully once we get something through, we get it moved down, we've moved to that implementation phase. And that's really that where we have that process improvement cycle. And that's where we move from formulation to implementation. We have our 4 steps, as we talked about. And it's really not, if it's a health policy, for example, it's not just about okay, here's the policy, make it work. You need to be looking at finances. You need to be looking at resources. You need to be looking at human capital, etc. One of the famous phrases in health policy are unfunded mandates. So things like ICD-10 implementation, HIPAA, overall privacy and security regulations. Those were unfunded mandates, meaning that they said, okay, you guys need to do this, but we're not going to give you any money to do it. So, making sure you're managing those financial assets and your resources to make sure you can get things done. ICD-10 is a good example. It's the diagnosis coding system and procedures for inpatient hospital, but mainly the diagnosis coding system used across the country. When we made that shift, I was actually doing a lot of ICD-10 training at that time. There were people that would spend $1 million to train their coders and their appropriate staff, revenue cycle staff, patient financial services. And then there were other organizations of the same size that would just have them do an online course that was not nearly as effective as the type of training that was being provided by folks like myself and many, many others across the country. So it's really, it depends on how things will work in your organizations. My guess is if we went back and did a study now and looked at error rates and issues related to ICD-10 submissions, those that spent a little more up front are probably not having as many issues on the back end. Those that didn't spend much money up front are probably losing money because the codes aren't as explicit as they need to be. Designing and rulemaking, obviously, and here, let's roll back here for a second, sorry. Designing and rulemaking are our first two phases in that implementation phase. So we may have a law, and then like HIPAA I think I used this example last week as well. So, the law has been passed, but now we need to implement that law. And we can't just say, okay, everyone has to do this. There's another whole design and rulemaking process that happens on the administrative side, and it's known ultimately as administrative law, but what we typically call it is a proposed rule and a final rule, and we're given the opportunity to comment on those. And we'll spend a bit more time about administrative law in the not too distant future, but it is part of that process. So then once we design and we have the rulemaking, then we can go on to those other things. I apologize for flipping back and forth. Once we have that design and rulemaking, then we can put things in place. Okay, let's move forward. Let's get this new rule in place and functioning and see if it actually behaves in the way that the rulemakers or the legislators thought that it would. So when we think about different types of work that is important to an organization that is implementing something. So let's use, for example, HIPAA. So the HIPAA privacy rules, a huge change for our industry in the way that we did things. How do we do that process? And it's really, kind of puzzle pieces. We need managers to be planners, to decide what we're going to do. We need others to organize and bring people together, create teams, whatnot. Then obviously staffing, so we need to make sure we have the right people to fill those teams. Directing, so serving in that role as, okay, I'm the head of the team and we're going to do this. But then on the controlling side, that's probably going to be a little higher up in the organization. Just regulating the whole process, making sure you're staying on task with your project plan, etc. So once we get things rolling, we've have operation in place. Now we're talking about evaluating. So it could be a whole new round of design, rulemaking, operating, but we always need to evaluate our policy, our rule, whatever it is that we might be doing to see, and again, like I said a minute ago, is this what we had expected? Is it performing in the way that we want? And if not, then we can always go to that modification phase. So, as the bullet says here, perfection eludes policymakers because it constantly, we can never please everybody. The purpose is to create a rule that will protect the masses. So if it's about getting access to care, if it's about HIPAA privacy, if it's about providing insurance coverage, whatever it might be, whenever the way we do it the first time is likely not going to be perfect. What happens after that is what's going to cause modification. I talked a little bit about the external environment. There are a multitude of people, things, the true external environment, like biological issues, ecological issues. There are so many things that impact policymaking, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we move forward in class. So it is a very cyclical process, as we talked about. There's kind of a cycle for the policy development and legislation piece, then there's another cycle for the implementation piece, and then that feeds back to modification. That initial legislative piece can be modified as well. So that little exhibit, it is in your text, is a helpful exhibit to kind of understand how they all work together. But the one thing that's important, and it is our discussion question for this week, policymaking is highly political. And as I had mentioned last week, a lot of the politicians that are making these decisions don't have, they may be lawyers, they may have been business people. The majority of them did not come from healthcare, yet they are tasked with making rules about healthcare, among other things that they don't know a lot about. So you need to keep that in mind when we're looking at these rules. But we also need to look at the fact that it is a political process. So, for example, altruism versus egoism. Are you putting forward a policy that's really going to just help the people in your constituency as opposed to all of the people the policy is going to affect? It's pretty egotistical to just, get money for your county when the policy is going to impact the whole state. Same with self-interest versus public interest. If there's an element of maybe pushing through a policy where, okay, if I push this through, someone else is going to do something for me. Obviously, that's very in self-interest, in the nature of self-interest, which happens sadly all the time, as opposed to public interest, which tends to be why folks get into politics. It's somewhere in that cycle where people tend to become jaded and don't serve as much of the public interest as they do the self-interest, their own self-interest. But it's all about, individual ethics. Interest groups are huge in this, and again, we'll talk a great deal about that, but not necessarily rational decision making, because these folks don't have the skill set to do rational decision making in some of these areas. Important points. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the opioid assignment. Hopefully I haven't gone too far over on time. Let's see. 17 minutes. Okay, we're not doing too bad so far. This will just take a minute. So we have a writing assignment this week. I apologize for being so scrunched here. Unfortunately, when you have it's a Turnitin assignment. So when you use Turnitin, it doesn't allow you to format the text. But what we're looking at in this written assignment is sometimes policymaking can have a positive impact or a negative impact. So there are some resources up here. These here, but there's a wealth of resources online with regard to opioids and policy being put in place to combat the opioid crisis. So what I want you to do is take a look at those pieces of information and take a look at how policy has impacted that. So think about, okay, at this point, 3 years ago, it started to ramp up, started to get really, really problematic. But a lot of policy has been put in place at the local level, state level, federal level to try and combat this epidemic. So how impactful has this actually been? So as the assignment says, analyze the impact of current policy with regard to illegal drugs, prescription drugs, the use of opioids. And then think about what type of work that you can look at it from your own local level, you can look at it from the state level. Do you think that these policies are creating a positive or a negative impact on opioid overdose deaths, transition to other drugs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty open. I just want you to take a look at some data, take a look at some policy out there for whatever area you choose, and then tell me if you think that policy is impactful. The data can hopefully give you some insight into that. The data that I've provided, and then I've also provided a database from Kaiser Family Foundation that you can dig into. But you'll likely also, just a simple Google search will probably turn up some decent articles in local newspapers, whatnot. So, and they'll typically cite data from other large databases. So that's what I'm looking for. All of my papers are APA format. In this case, I want the body of the paper to be 3 to 5 pages. But if you use resources, which you will, make sure you're citing those. Make sure you cite them in text. I am kind of an APA stickler, so you probably figured that out last time, but I am I'm looking for those types of things in the paper. So that's it. I hope everyone has a great week. Keep your eye out for additional info on the quiz that we took last week, problems there, and perhaps a little wrap up if needed. And otherwise, I will see you in the Flipgrid. Thanks.